Were they at the Capitol?
No, it's unlikely that any connection with that, but he had been talking about the likelihood of inevitability. And in fact, if we're live now, I'd mentioned on your stream quite a few times about, the real worry is the infrastructure here in America, that, it's okay if the federal government goes down, not such a big deal to most people, but if the power grid goes down, that could
Yeah.
affect people. And you see now.
Speaking of which, and Dooovid is my guest, Charles Moscowitz. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Dooovid and I do this every Thursday at 1:00 my time, Eastern time. Dooovid, you're out of Detroit. I'm out of Boston. We usually talk Jewish issues, Israel issues, spiritual issues. But we just started a little talk here that I want to just clarify, see if you have any information on, Dooovid. We've talked about the vulnerability of the American infrastructure in terms of going down and creating blackouts and brownouts, and that there could be foreign involvement in that. There's rumors that the Chinese could be involved, that there was one of these small prints in a recent executive order that was signed by President Biden in his first day in office, apparently does open up the national infrastructure to private ownership, and that could mean foreign ownership. I don't know much about that, but I only bring it up now, and since you brought it up, because I'm wondering about the present ice storm, which is affecting a big swath of the country, not so much my area in Boston, but certainly going south into Texas. And in Texas right now, there are major blackouts. I don't know if it's going on this minute as you and I are talking, but there's another storm apparently coming, and that there's been a major freeze over of electrical elements of the Texas infrastructure, and people are without power, and it's a huge crisis. Now, I don't know much about it, but it made me think about comments that you made, because I was looking at a news story on this, and it indicates that the state of Texas, for the past, I don't know how many years, if not decades, has had up to about 10% of its total power structure based on solar and wind. And while this isn't an indictment of solar and wind, I think it's safe to say that solar doesn't work at night. It doesn't work in cloudy weather conditions. And wind power, the wind turbines, apparently don't work if they're frozen over. And that this might have something to do with the collapse of the Texas power system. What do you have any information about that, Dooovid?
I haven't looked into the Texas situation. Although this is my background, like I'm a civil engineer, although I'm basically just a landlord by profession, but a trained civil engineer. I've been to countless conferences here in Metro Detroit. Check my YouTube or Facebook even for videos, and I've taken courses, at University of Michigan and online from Harvard, and all these courses on edX, where I've actually made the mathematical calculations for this. So I don't think the problem there might be some problem of trying to shift away from natural gas, or because of the wind power down there, or solar affecting the grid. But I think it's basically, like they said, it's probably faulty infrastructure that froze. And like in Texas, do you really want to spend a ton of money preventing the infrastructure from freezing, when in all likelihood it's only going to happen once of every tens of years, especially in the budget crunch that we're under now. And Trump, I didn't support politics, but like originally I thought Trump might be a good thing, largely because he was a builder, even religiously, like maybe he's going to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. But he focused on the wall, but it should have been the infrastructure. But it turned out, from my perspective, Trump was largely incompetent. He didn't actually benefit the infrastructure. And it was funny, Governor Whitmer, who ran years ago on fixing the damn roads, it was her campaign slogan. Now she has another campaign that the mail was coming out from Wisconsin or something, like another state, asking for money to help fix the roads in her campaign. But like, no, years later, she didn't fix the road. The infrastructure, I've been following this for 10 years, civil engineering, especially here in Metro Detroit, the infrastructure is horrible. There's hundreds of bridges, like in the rating system, of good shape, needs repair, beyond repair, borderline unsafe. God forbid, like 50% of the infrastructure in all of America is really like not only beyond the point of collapse, like it should have been repaired, but at the point where it's even difficult to repair because it's in so much disarray. And then you add to it, I mean, we had a few months ago, I think, Netanyahu greeted Jonathan Pollard in coming to Israel, but Jonathan Pollard had stolen the U.S.'s intelligence about the infrastructure in the Middle East. So at this point, honestly, I think our government is largely incompetent. Probably the people on intelligence agencies and all that are incompetent. And I would not be surprised if China and Russia and all of these places do have access to our infrastructure. And rather than tell us that, they just remain incompetent. Like I was saying on Week in Review, God forbid the U.S. government has already fallen and they just haven't told us yet, God forbid. But, that perspective, the unfortunate situation is that if China and Russia and all these places had hacked into our system and have our infrastructure, us as U.S. citizens have absolutely no way of verifying it. Even like coronavirus, is it made in a lab? Did it come from Wuhan? The new information, did it come from the U.S.? Say, it's conspiracy theory, but as a U.S. citizen, you have absolutely no way to verify it, and the government won't give us answers. It's still like, we know what we're doing. Trust the plan. God forbid.
It's all very deep state. But, and that, yes, certainly Trump could have done a better job with infrastructure. I think that there was a congressional bill passed that funded infrastructure, and there was at least some start on that. Even Obama, I think, started doing some infrastructure development, although in his case, most of the money just went to help the states keep their governments running at a time of recession, which basically ended up in the pocket of a lot of political hacks. But putting that aside, the one thing Trump did do was that he enhanced energy production domestically with fracking and with oil and gas and fossil fuel production. And the result was that for the first time since, I believe, World War II, the United States was energy independent. We were no longer dependent upon foreign oil, Arab oil. And Biden, in his first acts as president, began to undo that. Now, that doesn't mean that that's why the Texas situation is what it is. But I found it interesting that Texas, which is one of the major creators of energy in this country, the oil industry, had upwards of 10% of its total infrastructure, oil grid, its energy grid, powered by wind and solar. Now, I don't know if that is why there's a crash in this, but I think that it very well may be something that ought to be investigated, and it very well could mean the death knell for the Green New Deal.
I think they said it's because of frozen gas lines. So, it might be related that they shifted the infrastructure towards wind and other things.
Okay.
My guess is that it's basically purely caused by the cold.
I'm just hoping that it's investigated.
Well, they will, but as an engineer, you say like, it's pretty clear that it corresponded with the cold temperature, and when you listen to it, it seems pretty likely that the pipes froze, and that's why there's no gas. It doesn't. Just to mention real quick,
pipes were frozen in Texas versus Maine and Massachusetts, but putting that aside,
because they've been weatherized. As an engineer, it's pretty clear. It's saying because if you're in the north, they use different type pipes that have colder temperatures, and it costs more money.
All right,
but if you're in the south, you don't want to spend the money doing that. And just to mention, your chat box on YouTube isn't working. It hasn't been working for like a week or two. I'm not sure if it's something you know how to fix, but if people had been in the YouTube...
I don't know how to fix it. If you have any advice on how to fix that, I'd appreciate it. Let me just see if I can do like a chat from the Zoom. I've set up a chat here. I see both our names. Maybe people can chat with us there. But
no, they need the majority of people watch on YouTube and they use the YouTube chat. You don't really monitor it, but I
don't monitor it mainly because, thanks for bringing it up. I'm a very bad technician, but when I do this, I'm looking at you and talking to you right now through the Zoom, and I can't have both the YouTube and the Zoom up because they're both two different sound frequencies. And so we can't hear, it'll overlap. Now, if I can figure out how to do that, maybe somebody can advise me.
Maybe we should schedule a time offline and me, you, and my streaming partner, Jennifer, Church of Entropy.
Oh, I would really appreciate that because I am so ham-handed in terms of handling this wonderful technology, but I would love to be able to figure out how to maybe mute the Zoom so that I could let the sound go through YouTube and I could actually watch the chat and read the chat. I'm also looking at chats from TikTok and I sometimes read those, but the YouTube is, of course, the flagship station of this live stream, which is carried by about a dozen live streams. And then I, of course, archive it on Podomatic, which means as an audio podcast, it goes on Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, and about a half a dozen others. So I really am trying to develop a technology which really disseminates the program both live and as a podcast in as many venues as I can. Now, I
just to mention it, you're streaming it twice, one with video, one with just audio. So the one with just audio, that one, the chat's working. And I'm not a Zoom expert, so we don't have to waste time online. But maybe sometime.
Let's do that. I would really like that because I'd like to sit down and put down on a notebook all the steps I need to take because it gets very complex. Plus I'm recording and this is all the stuff going on. Anyway, Dooovid, I want to switch gears. We talked a little bit in advance doing a little show.
I relate that to the infrastructure as a civil engineer, like my point, like why I think representational democracy is doomed to fail is largely engineering. And, the incompetence level.
People who are ignorant.
I'm saying no one in government understands engineering. Maybe like 1%. I mean, you have a few medical doctors, but
we should absolutely. Where's this Army Corps of Engineers? There are some people that are in government who know engineering. I mean, but putting that aside, Dooovid,
not elected representatives who have to vote on budgets. Obviously, there's governmental engineers, and then obviously, God forbid, as an engineer who works in the field, went to top schools. You do not want to work for the government. I mean, there's a handful of people that first choice work for the government, but generally, it's incompetent people that end up working for the government. I don't know what school you went to, but generally, it's not the top tier. It's not even the B class people.
I can see you running for Congress. Maybe take on Rashida Tlaib.
Well, you're proving that you don't understand what I'm saying. I'm saying the representative democratic system is broken. No, I do not want to run the conference. I do not want to be incompetent. Saying there really is no way to be competent.
Who has some knowledge of engineering in the halls of Congress. Anyway, let's go on to the eugenics question. We talked about this in advance of the show. You told me that there is this sort of nascent neo-eugenic movement that apparently includes certain intellectuals in Israel who seem to think that some kind of a eugenic program is a good idea. I find that to be particularly appalling for anyone who has any remote connection to Judaism, given the fact that this the Nazi race philosophy. I mean, this goes back to Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who was the father of eugenics, and he also invented a lot of things like surveying and other innovations at the turn of the century, and who they viewed the idea of breeding superior members of the human race or human species and kind of marginalizing those whom they deem to be less well born, as the word eugenic means in Greek. And this was taken as a legitimate science by the Darwinists in the mid to late 19th century, and by their German counterpart, Ernst Haeckel, who was considered they called him Darwin's bulldog in Europe, and who wrote science books showing, the evolution of the fetus going through a fish stage and like a mammal stage. I mean, total crackpot stuff. And that it inspired the Nazis. Now, how could it be that Jewish, scientists and thinkers are advocating this now? Or what is it that they're advocating?
Well, so there's two different. So I'm mentioning this book by John Glad called Jewish Eugenics, and it's published about 10 years ago. And I'll just read the dedication.
Okay.
Dedicated to the memory of those Jewish and non-Jewish eugenicists who were defamed and persecuted in the Western world, some of whom had earlier been driven into exile from Hitler's Germany, even as other of their colleagues perished. In homage to both eugenicists and their opponents who were victimized, imprisoned, and murdered under communist rule, in acknowledgement of today's eugenicists, again, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who continue their struggle to defend the genetic patrimony of future generations, and in respect for those scholars and scientists who may disagree with them, but who share their selfless concern for the future of humanity. And I want to talk about this for two reasons. One, I think factually, if you look into it, that the most popular place, the most books written about eugenics in the world are actually in Israel and in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And then also the prominent role that Jews played in eugenics and even the Zionist movement, that probably well over half of the original Zionists were eugenicists. And if you look at the past, historically, up until World War I, even most rabbis had agreed that eugenics is generally a Jewish thing. And the question, what happened in Nazi Germany?
Be careful there, Dooovid. I mean, this feeds anti-Semitism. I don't want to do that on my show.
Well, so you got to read the books and the literature, and I have multiple books.
Yeah, but even if what you're saying might have some truth to it, let's just tread carefully. We're both. I
have Edwin Black's book here too.
I get that, but I'm just pointing out that you and I are both fairly devout Jews. We're both pro-Israel. Doesn't matter. The YouTube will pick up a word here and there, and they'll think we're anti-Semites. I'm just saying. I mean, you don't.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I think it's historical, where there has to be. So, I mean, the reason I mentioned the topic, like a month ago, they had I forget the woman from former director of the Washington D.C. Holocaust Museum, and she spoke at the Michigan Holocaust Museum about Nazi doctors and eugenics. And then this woman, I hardly think
that the Nazi doctors were Jewish. I mean,
I was saying that eugenics was generally
the chief eugenicist in Nazi Germany was Josef Mengele.
No, I mean, because you have a false perception of historical revisionism, and it makes sense that you have it, because there's two things to say. What the Nazis did actually had absolutely nothing to do with eugenics, and that there was a positive thing called eugenics that got blamed for what the Nazis did incorrectly. And this is an Israeli Jewish opinion, to say that, don't think that eugenics caused the Holocaust. God forbid. Eugenics
that's abominable.
It was a distortion. Well, I think that's your opinion, probably because you haven't researched the topic.
I have researched it,
but I'm mentioning it that this woman, she's developing a curriculum. She had taught a course in Auschwitz about eugenics, and the idea that the first victims of the Nazis were partially from eugenics, and that was the killing of retards, God forbid, and it was done by doctors, and even the gas chambers and burning the bodies were likely first tested
on eugenics,
on German retards, God forbid, and because that was a word they used at the time, and that there was very little debate about it. There
was public outcry actually among Germans, which is why the Nazis stopped doing it.
But not among the doctors. That the doctors at the time generally supported eugenics.
It's all science. And by the way, I have done some research on this. It's included in my book called The Apostles of Evolution. I wrote this, one of my first books. It's a pretty big book too, in which I looked at the eugenics movement in the United States, which actually was the main font of the eugenics, of the so-called science, the pseudoscience of eugenics. And people like Madison Grant and others going back, you had, I can't really recall all of it right now on the tip of my hand, but I wrote this book a long time ago, but I show that it was really kind of a liberal, left-leaning, progressive establishment thing dressed in science that goes back to the turn of the century. It was primarily WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The Rockefellers were involved in a lot of the financing of it. You had these major figures of culture involved. You had the laboratory in Long Island, New York, Oyster Bay Laboratory was the main center of it back then. They're still there. They don't do eugenics now. They stopped at World War II. But the point is that it was all the rage. You had a Supreme Court decision in 1925, Buck versus Bell, where Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a decision saying that it was perfectly legal to forcibly sterilize this woman because she was seen as mentally defective because she was promiscuous. This young woman, Buck, and the state of Maryland could sterilize her. And it resulted in this huge movement. I mean, and this is something that there's a new book out about this, where women were being put in these asylums for various things and sterilized and all kinds of tortures, all in the name of this new science of eugenics, and that this science inspired the Nazis. I think there's some truth to that. Margaret Sanger is a classic example of a eugenicist who wanted to set up abortion clinics in the Black neighborhoods, what's called the Negro Project, because she wanted to cull what she called a dysgenic race. And it was entirely racist. It was entirely based upon Darwinian understanding of evolution, where some people are more evolved than others, which is the logical and indeed scientific, quote unquote, conclusion you'd have to draw from the Darwinian theory. There's no other way to look at it. And in fact, Darwin was a big advocate of this. His second book was all over this. And it was seen as left and the main opponents of it in this country were conservatives, Catholics, anti-abortion groups, some of the same people that are around today. And the idea that it's not connected to the Nazis is absolutely heinous and ridiculous. It was all about the Nazi movement. It was an entirely pseudo-scientific eugenic movement.
And I mean, God forbid you're just inaccurate, unfortunately. I've done the research. I can demonstrate
not inaccurate.
it. Well, I'm saying that eugenics was probably
today is disgusting.
Well, I say eugenics was probably in its first conception largely a Jewish science that was perverted by the Nazis.
Not a Jewish
have you heard of Morris Fishberg?
No,
I have his book here. I mean, it's written in
sure
America.
He was there, and I'm sure he was Jewish, but that
even like the AJC and even questions like are Jews white or are Jews descended from the original Hebrews? And in fact, like I saw the testimony, the AJC in the 1920s testified that Jews are absolutely not descended from the ancient Israelites that were a European people, and it probably had reason why they did it because it meant immigration status. But the question, are Jews white?
What is the origin? As I said, Dooovid, this was all the rage of the liberal.
No, it's not all the rage. I'm making a point.
The Jewish establishment was just about as much a part of that as anyone else.
Well, I'm saying the Jews are actually probably the biggest proponents of eugenics. And I'm saying you are proof of it. Just look in the mirror and you say you are a result of eugenics. And as a Jew today,
eugenics, I mean,
well, I say, how did Jews become so white?
How
is it that 25% of Jews in Ashkenazic Jews have blue eyes and 10% have blonde hair?
Probably.
The what?
Probably because of intermarriage over.
Well, I mean, yeah, but saying you could have intermarried with anybody, and the percentage of people on the planet with blue eyes and blonde hair is pretty small. So if Jews purposely, I mean, there's evidence I showed in the Jewish literature about saying. I make 2 points. I mean, I say this as a Jew who loves Israel and the Jewish people. White supremacy is a bigger problem in the Jewish community than in the European community. And breeding, so to say, for lighter features is basically mainstream Judaism, even till today. But historically, it's even in Rashi, even in the older times, that Jews selected for lighter features.
They wanted to pass as white. It was easier in society. I get that.
But I'm saying that your ancestors who were in Europe and had a choice to breed one way or another, purposely chose to breed for lighter features, and that was eugenic.
They wanted to pass as white. I mean, that's because whites, the Jews in Europe were the only minority.
Well, I mean, Jews are the biggest proof of eugenics. Just the fact, if you look today at how white Jews are, that's the result of eugenics. There's no other explanation.
It's the result of intermarriage, and it's the result.
Yeah, but saying it's not the result of intermarriage because you could have intermarried with blacks and Arabs. You didn't. You intermarried with whites, and that's why you're so white today because you selected for whiter features.
If you look at Sephardic Jews they look more Sephardic. If you look at Mizrahi Jews,
Not true. Sephardic Jews have 30% blue eyes also. I mean, Mizrahi, like Arab Jews, but even Sephardic Jews have 30%.
I don't think that many Jews.
Because you haven't seen the studies. But I'm saying,
No,
just go to any synagogue, look at a Jewish leadership
My
seminar.
evidence of that is anecdotal.
It's not anecdotal. It's in the literature. Even Morris Fishberg, 100 years ago, talks about selecting for lighter features. Even in the 1850s, there were Jews who said that we should select for lighter features. That the idea of trying to become lighter featured was likely Jewish in origin. Europeans who were from Europe didn't need to select for lighter features. Our ancestors who were not from Europe and wanted to assimilate, we're the ones who selected for lighter features.
I get that.
And even the question of the origin, I look back in the literature 400 or 500 years, and even Nazi Germany, the question remains today within anti-Semites is, if a Jew has blonde hair and blue eyes, are they really Jewish? And a few hundred years ago, that was already a question, like how did these Jews get blonde hair and blue eyes? And so in Europe for hundreds of years, the answer was because they're not Jewish, they're us, and they're just Jewish of religion. And that was actually a mainstream in assimilation, the pushback to say, we're not ancient Israelites, we're European people. And that was the official position of the Jewish body in America. That was in immigration. We testified in front of Congress. We passed legislation saying that we're white, we're not Jews.
Because it was the social pressures and the cultural pressures were to pass as white. That doesn't, and by the way, I don't think that.
But we're not white. You're saying we had to select. Europeans are white because they're Europeans. If we're white, it's because we practice eugenics.
We try to find someone.
You don't see what I'm saying? If you're not European, you're a Jew. So if you appear white, it has to be that your ancestors practice eugenics. There's no other explanation.
They probably, I don't know if I'd call it eugenics. I'd call it intermarriage. I'd call it.
But not just intermarriage, not because they intermarried. They purposely selected to breed with lighter featured people.
A spouse who was lighter.
You're not bragging about your half black kid.
All right.
You're not bragging about your cousin who intermarried with Indians and blacks. Your ancestors overwhelmingly intermarried with people who were lighter featured.
I think that, frankly, in the United States, probably most groups, including black people, tried to find a spouse who had lighter features and lighter skin, because
no one more than the Jews, though. I'm saying it as a fact. I'm saying, I don't want to cause anti-Semitism. That's not my point. But saying you as a Jew, that no one breeds for lighter feature like the Jews. I mean, a lot of blacks that want their blonde trophy wife. What Middle Eastern people succeeded?
If they're in the United States, they do.
Look at how successful the Jewish people were at eugenics. That just now
world.
Well, I'm saying because you chose. You chose to live in a white world. Your ancestors chose.
Well, however it happened, we lived in Europe and in the United States where it is white. I don't want to use the word white supremacy, but it's a white dominated culture where there are benefits, social benefits with passing for white. And I think that's probably true of any ethnic group that lived in the West. The problem is that it was only Jews in Europe for 1,000 years. They were the only group that were not Christian. They were the only group that were not quote unquote white. So yes, they tried to pass.
But we were white. They're saying that the evidence is.
Well, then how is it, Dooovid, that if you have Jews living in Yemen or Ethiopia or Africa or the Middle East or China, they don't look white. They look more like their own ethnic group because they were trying to pass as Chinese or they were trying to pass as Arab. The point is, we haven't
examined the evidence. I'm saying, just for the people, I'm not saying Charles knows quite a bit about this, but I've read hundreds of years.
How is it that Arab Jews they look more Arab than they look?
But it's not true. 5%, even Mizrahi Jews, about 5% have blonde hair and blue eyes. Even 15%, even 15% of Jews. My rabbi from Afghanistan has green eyes. That they say no, that the Jews in Bukharia also have an exceedingly high percent of likely European blood. It's the Jews in Yemen that are the only Jews that say generally most Jews, including Sephardim, have quite a high percent relatively of blonde hair and blue eyes. The Yemenite Jews have almost no blonde hair and blue eyes.
I don't know where we're going with this. All I can say is
it's the point of eugenics.
It's not eugenics. It's intermarriage. It's trying to pass as white. It's cultural. It's conversion.
But that's eugenics.
And the same
intermarriage. You're saying that you were forced. You're saying that your ancestor was forced by punishment to marry a blue-eyed person. That's why
No, but
they
I'm
didn't
saying
choose. They didn't have a choice of blacks and blue-eyed people and choose the blue-eyed people
What
over
I
the
would
blacks.
suggest-
That they were forced
Well, they weren't
against their
forced.
will to marry blue-eyed people, and that's
No,
why
but
you stand
they
today
had
with lighter
cultural-
features.
They had cultural pressure to conform to the
They
establishment.
had cultural preference, not pressure. They chose.
no, and
our
they chose-
ancestors chose out
Okay,
of our free
my
will
grandfather
to
changed-
select for lighter features.
My grandfather, his family came to this country, they were extremely poor, and there was anti-Semitism back then. And so he literally changed his last name so that he wouldn't look Jewish. Nobody would know, so he could get a job. I'm just saying that there are let me finish here. There were real social, cultural pressures on immigrant Jews. There were
Your grandfather practiced eugenics. You admit it.
I don't think that, I wouldn't call this eugenics.
Because they weren't Nazis. I'm not saying your grandfather was a Nazi. I'm saying your grandfather practiced eugenics, and what the Nazis did was a perversion.
I reject that. He was not practicing eugenics. He was trying
because he aimed to become whiter. Eugenics means, in the bad way, is that people are trying to become whiter. And you're saying that your ancestors tried to become whiter purposely.
Or they tried to appear whiter so that they could get a job. It was a cultural force. It wasn't that they were into biology.
Well, let us say that no, your ancestors chose to become whiter because they were white supremacists. I don't buy this crap that you're claiming that your grandfather tried to become whiter just because he wanted to succeed in America. Your grandfather, God forbid, was probably a white supremacist.
He was not a white supremacist. He also was a Jew, and he was proud to be, but he needed to get a job. He had a family, and he was not.
He took advantage of being white.
He was not a.
He took advantage of being white.
So, and look, this is almost.
He took advantage of the fact that his ancestors had practiced eugenics. The reason they practiced eugenics, so when he came here to America, he could have advantage from the hundreds of years of selectively breeding for lighter features. This is also
part of Black history, that Black people tried to pass as white. They tried to marry white. They tried to, because you had to get ahead in this society, which is white supremacist, or was. And that there was a kind of an unspoken dominance by white people, English descended people, Catholics.
I think that white supremacy is a worse problem among Jews and even in Israel than among Europeans. That's the evidence. They say that white supremacy, the biggest problem, is more of a problem among us than
white supremacy somehow is implying that white people are superior to non-white people. I don't think that because they're biologically superior. I don't think that's what eugenics is. It's a science. That's not what they were doing. It was a cultural phenomenon that existed amongst all ethnic minorities in this country to pass as white because the white people controlled the good, powerful position in the society. They weren't doing it because they wanted to improve their biology. They weren't doing it because they wanted to create a superior race. They were doing it because they wanted to get a freaking job. It has nothing to do with any science of eugenics. The science of eugenics is something that actually scientifically looks at race as a thing and says, this race we should advance and this race should not.
Is it possible your grandfather, and I look at my mother, my own family, even myself, Noam Chomsky debated this guy, Rudy Rockman, last week. And Noam Chomsky said it himself, that he is unsure whether he's a Jew. He's culturally a Jew, but he doesn't think that there's enough evidence to consider himself genetically Jewish, that your grandfather looked in the mirror and he wasn't sure whether he was a Jew or not. No, and he said, maybe I'm just a European who's culturally Jewish.
No, he knew he was.
Looked, did I really descend from Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac? And he said, no.
No, he believed
I just culturally a Jew. That's what Noam Chomsky
first of all,
said.
The name Moscowitz actually means son of Moses. So I think that was something that was believed by my grandfather and by his family.
But when he came to America and he looked in the mirror, he said, I'm no son of Moses. He saw his gray eyes and said, I'm no son of Moses. I'm white.
He said he was a son of Moses, but that in order to eat, he's going to have to go underground and change his name to a more Protestant sounding name. And that's
so you're the anachrorizing that I said at the time, that at the time that your grandfather was probably not like, oh, I'm definitely a Jew, but I got to go underground to get ahead. Your grandfather probably thought that he wasn't Jewish.
That's not true.
And that was because you haven't read the literature of the time. Saying, unless your grandfather was an Orthodox Jew, the Reform rabbis said it already in America 100 years ago, that we're not ethnic Jews. We're Jewish by culture. It's our religion. We're not ethnically
Look,
Jewish,
the Reform movement completely denies the ethnicity of Judaism. I mean, they believe Judaism is just a religion and nothing more. Judaism is an ethno-religion. We are a religion, but we also...
So is it okay that you got Alan Dershowitz, is it okay that your grandfather lied? That he used his light features to pretend to be white, to get into America and get ahead. Okay. And now you're coming out like, oh, I was a Jew the whole time. My grandfather just lied when he said when he changed his name and pretended like he was white.
Yes, it was okay for him.
And you say it's okay. Like I'm proud of my grandfather for changing his name and pretending like he was white and pretending like he wasn't Jewish. I'm very proud of him.
I am proud of him because he needed to survive. He needed to feed his family. He had no skills. He was not a professional. He was having trouble getting a job, and he needed to do that to survive.
So you owe black people reparations for that. You got ahead pretending your family got ahead, pretending they were something they weren't, and now you owe black people reparations for that.
All right. I mean, I guess you could make that argument. He did get ahead pretending he was not Jewish, but he was Jewish. My father had a bar mitzvah. They were not observant, but they were pretty good standing in a synagogue. You know, they're buried in a Jewish cemetery. I mean, they considered themselves, they lived a relatively traditional Jewish life. And they were not secretive about that amongst their own. But when it came to going out and getting a job, he passed himself off as white. Fine. That's what they did because that's what he felt he had to do at the time. That was, I think, typical. I mean, if you were Italian in this country, people changed their name to a more waspy name. The Irish even did this. I mean, this is new immigrant groups. In order to fit into this country, in order to make it, they Americanized to an extent.
They became white supremacists. You're saying that in order to make it, they accepted white supremacy and supported it and joined it.
It was fine. Okay. The country, look, America up until maybe around World War II, in the de facto sense, was a white supremacist society. The white people controlled the high ground in every area you could name. You know, I mean, the Rockefellers, for example, were white.
What blame do you think Jews have that? And especially if you look in the literature and
you see the same level as any other immigrant group coming to America who wanted to assimilate and get ahead. My grandfather was an assimilationist. He wanted to be American, and his understanding of being an American was to be white. Now, was he right about that? I think that you have to look at it in the context of the times where he lived. That's what was going on in America. You know, it was even...
You say that from today's perspective, unfortunately, we have to admit our grandparents were racist.
No, I don't think that it's...
Maybe for the time it's an anachronism to call them racist, but certainly from a modern day perspective, our grandparents were racist.
I think in the de facto sense, this whole country was racist in that we had the ideal person was the white, Anglo-Saxon, blue-eyed, blonde-haired person. That was the ideal. That's
so
what
the question is, where does this concept that white is better than dark come from? And unfortunately, it seems to have the most backing in Jewish literature. I might do a study on it. Rashi himself says almost all of our rabbinic text, not that it's like white supremacy is behind our text, but this concept that sin makes our skin darker is almost universal in Jewish texts. That there's a concept that the cause of dark skin is sin. Right. Rashi says it, the Shulchan Aruch says it. Even modern, I mean, God forbid, when I went to Israel, it's almost commonplace accepted that, and it comes mostly from our text. You think the Europeans who were Christianized maybe had a concept of it, but if they're secularized, that there's such a concept of white supremacy probably didn't come from white people. It probably came from people like us who were trying to become white because we idolized whiteness because we weren't white, and it wasn't the white people who thought we were better. It was us who thought the white people were better. And it's
I don't doubt that there might be an element of that in our tradition. And in fact, I could even look at the Torah when you had Miriam.
Just the word Yafet, the word. I was claiming the concept that just saying that pretty blue eyes is basically a racist statement. If you think blue eyes are prettier than brown eyes, you're a racist. But what's the word for European? It's called Yafet. That Jews always thought
That's
Blonde
right.
hair and blue
Climate
eyes are
Papa.
pretty. We even call the progenitor of the European people by the name Yaphet, which means pretty.
Fine. I don't doubt that that's part. I mean, look at in the Torah, didn't Miriam in the Sinai criticize Moses because he took an Ethiopian wife? In fact, that's why she got leprosy. God punished her for that because and I think that might have had a little to do with race. He said, "You've taken a wife among the Hamites." Or
Yeah,
the
but
Nubians.
generally, it's likely that in ancient times, Jews thought that there was a medium between the North and the South, and there were certain characteristics like the Northern Europeans are pretty and maybe
I don't
smarter,
doubt that.
but the Africans are smarter. I mean, are tougher, and but whatever the case was, we thought we were the golden mean. It's not good to be too light. It's not good to be too dark. But in the biblical times, the vast majority of the people we dealt with were darker skinned people. It wasn't really till after the closing of the biblical canon, the Greeks and the Romans,
Right.
that the Jews started dealing with lighter skinned people. And then from the record, it happens about 300 AD that these concepts of, I actually have the book on the curse of Ham, but the idea that the blacks were cursed into slavery due to Ham, it's likely that that comes in like the 3rd century and permeates Christianity and Islam. And then this other concept that
I don't think
sinning causes a person to become darker becomes basically mainstay in Jewish theology, till today. I've talked to black converts who even agree with it, because it's like, if you're a black convert and you've actually studied our text, it says it all over the place. And I've actually, I've even spoke to black converts who agree that sin caused their ancestors, through over sexualization, to become darker, and Dutton may be called like high testosterone levels, but God forbid that will call the basis of eugenics. And also you say you agree, almost all Jews agree, you don't want to use the term eugenics, but you say, like, not like Kevin McDonald and a group evolutionary strategy, but like Jews selected for intelligence, that the rabbis had a bunch of kids, and it was like when eugenics came out, most of the rabbis, even ultra-Orthodox, agreed it was a good thing. In fact, like Dor Yeshorim, the organization that tests for Tay-Sachs and various things, I think that predates World War I. And they, I believe, were a eugenics organization that originally Dor Yeshorim that tested for these diseases. But I mean, anyone who knows Judaism, you say like, well, of course our ancestors selected for more intelligent people. And that's why, Jews have high IQs, because we practice eugenics for intelligence in the way before eugenics had a dirty word. But at the same time, you say, yes, Jews practice eugenics for things like intelligence, but it seems unquestionable that Jews also practice eugenics to get lighter features. And the proof is in the pudding. When you look at the Jewish people today, and 20% of us have blue eyes and like 8% of us have blonde hair, the proof is in the pudding that we practice eugenics.
Well, first of all, I mean, it's interesting that your history is probably right in that the Torah says that the 3 sons of Moses, you had Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and that Shem was the father of the Jewish people and Arab people, and it was kind of the middle ground, whereas Ham was the father of Africa, who was black, and Japheth was white. He was the father of the Greeks, the Javan, and that maybe they did view the Semites, the sons of Shem, as a halfway point. They did live in the world of Ham, because I think that the Canaanites were Ham. And after the Roman conquest, and the Romans didn't have any conception of race, apparently. I mean, they didn't care. All they cared about was whether you were loyal to the emperor.
It was possible it would have been cheaper to buy a blue-eyed slave than a black-skinned slave in
Yeah,
Rome or
they would do
Jerusalem.
it.
There was probably a period of time where it was cheaper to buy, blonde-haired, blue-eyed slave in
Probably.
Rome than a black slave.
Yeah, they didn't care. In fact, the Septiman emperors were black, so it wasn't like they were conscious of this. I think that in Judaism, there is, as you say, there was a consciousness of that, but I think it had more to do with a cultural consciousness, that we're descended from the 12 tribes of Israel, and that there's kind of a tribal element to it. I get the fact that maybe there was also a racial component to that. I don't think that was ever emphasized, nor is it today. I think it had more to do with the idea that we're descended from those who witnessed the miracle at Sinai. I mean, if you go to any synagogue on certain days, you have people who are Kohen and people who are Levi who can engage in certain special ceremonies. You know this, the benediction. And, there's like a place where God set aside them to be the priests of the ancient temple. And so there's kind of a tribal thing going on there that we're, having said that, we've always had converts. We've always had the Erev Rav, the multitudes who came in, who followed us out of Egypt, were Egyptian, and they assimilated into the Jewish people. Ruth was a convert. She was a Moabitess. She's the grandmother of King David. So, there's, the racial component is probably there. I don't think that it's, I mean, if you want to call it eugenics, I mean, I think that the term eugenics is something that describes a modern scientization of this and a weaponization of it. And also, let me just say, from a scientific standpoint, and
did what the Nazis did completely discredit the concept that you could use selective breeding for better
Okay,
features.
cool.
And in Israel today, can people say, despite what happened in Nazi Germany, we want to practice eugenics. We want to, and even if someone said in Israel, because I'll tell you, this breeding for lighter features is extremely common in Israel. And if you're in Israel right now, and you say, I want my kid to have blue eyes because he's going to have a better future if he has blue eyes than if he doesn't, and to selectively breed for that, is that okay?
Well, first of all, the premise of eugenics, which is that you can breed for more intelligence, is complete bunk. There's no proof of that at all. You can have extremely intelligent people who
What are the most common choices for in genetic? I mean, in terms of breeding, that it's almost breeding for lighter features is more common than breeding for intelligence. Saying Jews may be breeded for
first of all, you can't breed
Jews. We breeded for intelligence and lighter features, but,
but
generally,
the whole idea that you can breed for intelligence is disproven.
But you could breed for lighter features. That's
all right.
That's definite. You could definitely breed for lighter features.
First of all, I think we could give an anecdote to that, and that is you bring up the state of Israel. When the state of Israel was established, and in the first maybe generation, maybe up to the 1960s, and even up to the beginning of the second Aliyah, the big one, which was in 1890s, 1880s, they were Europeans. They were white appearing Europeans mostly from Poland and Russia and the Eastern area.
I have it on my YouTube. I mean, God forbid they even sterilized Moroccans.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm telling you, like, it's a fact that Zionists practice eugenics. They, in fact,
you're right.
Most Sfardim say they committed war crime. There's a substantial evidence that there were eugenic war crimes committed against Sfardim by Ashkenazic Jews.
Dooovid, you're right. There's a terrible history there. It's not widely known. I've talked about this. Yes, there was an elite that controlled Israeli society that were very European, that certainly thought of themselves as white, people like David Ben-Gurion, people like Shimon Peres, and, the founding generation, those guys were white, or they were Europeans.
Well, till today, like 90% of the elite in Israel till today are white.
Well, the point I'm making here,
generals,
well, wait a minute.
Business leaders.
Yeah, but the point I'm making here is that
that's why I said white supremacy is a worse problem in Israel than in America. Would you accept that to a certain extent white supremacy is worse in Israel than America?
If I could get to my conclusion here, is that has changed drastically in Israel, starting probably in the 60s and 70s, due to intermarriage, due to an influx of Sephardic and Mizrahic Jews, due to an influx of Ethiopian Jews. Yes, Israel has some racial issues, but it is a much more integrated country now. I can give an anecdote of my own cousin, who basically made Aliyah to Israel in the 1960s with his wife, his new wife, they both together. I think in his case, he didn't want to go to Vietnam, but he did. He was a religious Jew. He was Orthodox. And he settled in a kibbutz in Israel, had 4 children with his wife, both American background. Of the 4 children, 3 of them married Sephardic Jews, in one case, an Ethiopian Jew. And their grandchildren are not white American. They're not European. They don't appear, they don't look that way. And I think that
was there a mismatch? I mean, just to prove my point, was there a mismatch where the darker skinned person had substantially more accomplishments than your
No.
family, and that it was considered like
I'm saying that this
equal
is
marriage
changing.
because the darker skinned person, served in the IDF and your family didn't, or had more money or something like
look,
that.
Ken-
Where in Israeli society, that all things equal, is that marrying an Ashkenazi, if you're Sephardi, is an accomplishment. You have to do something
fine,
substantial in Israeli
but
society
the end
to
result
merit
of that-
marrying a white Jew.
All right. So then three of my
Even in your own family, does your own family demonstrate that or prove against it? You're saying
my own family proves that maybe 3 out of my 4 cousins in Israel, the 4 children of my cousin, they had Sephardic spouses who married into that family, maybe because they wanted to marry an Ashkenazi Jew. I don't doubt that. Maybe that's part of it. The point is that the practical result of that is that you've had a weakening of those kinds of distinctions. They are no longer Sephardic. I mean, they're half Sephardic, but the children are, they're, I guess you could say in an American context, they're mixed. I remember somebody once asked me if
but I'm saying in the Israeli political context, there's political parties for those mixed people. You have the splitting up between the Sephardic.
It's not moving in that direction. It's
it is. They're saying Netanyahu, Mizrahi in these groups for the mixed-blooded, Arab, European Jews versus the parties that represent the unmixed Sephardic Jews and the parties that represent the unmixed Ashkenazi Jews. I mean, that's
Israel today is one of the most ethnically and racially diverse countries in the world in terms of not just the numbers of different Jews who came there from all over the world with their own ethnic background, but due to the intermarriage, and again, I know it's an anecdote, but my own family is not atypical. Apparently, this is almost the standard in Israel now.
It's about 30%. There's about a 30% intermarriage rate between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim.
I think it's probably over 50%.
No, it's like 30%.
And it's a growing phenomena. And
it's not. I mean, I don't mean to discredit you, but
extreme differentiation, as there was in the beginning, between Ashkenazi and Sephardic. It just isn't as pronounced.
Yeah, I mean, that's your Hasbara. Like I have people on my own YouTube page who are Israeli disagreeing. I have Sephardim and Mizrahi on my own YouTube page who are saying what you're saying is not true. I mean, it's kind of like a Hasbara.
True or it isn't true. And I would suggest that the facts on the ground indicate that it is true.
Yeah, and by the way, even giving a factual representation of the political parties, because the political parties in Israel almost all are ethnic representation. There's almost not a single party in Israel that doesn't basically represent an ethnic group of Jews.
It's much less so, and the lines are becoming much more
increasing. You're saying that there's a party for mixed people, that there's parties for mixed-blooded people doesn't change the fact. But if you're mixed-blooded,
I'm sorry to hear that. My impression is that it's lessened, but if what you're saying is true,
that's why I wanted to bring this up, because I'm
glad
saying,
you are bringing it up.
I love Judaism and Israel, but I'm unfortunately, I mean, the evidence seems to be overwhelming that
I don't think
that
so.
Israel has a bigger problem than the U.S. and Europe in this.
I'm going to have on some. I've had Israelis on in the past. I've called some professors, and I'm going to look into this. I hope what you're saying is not true. I'm not saying it isn't. But if it is true, and all of a sudden Israel's becoming more divided on ethnic lines, then it shows the very evil element of eugenics in any society. We don't want to have that. I don't want to see.
We're saying the opposite. They're saying eugenics is intrinsically something that is part of Judaism, that Jews believe that you're supposed to practice eugenics. We're supposed to select for traits that are good and avoid traits that are bad. It's in our text.
To select Jewish spouses.
They're saying, God forbid, I didn't mean Nazi Germany or racism or any of these things, but the concept of eugenics is essentially a kosher concept. You say racism isn't kosher,
and that we're supposed to.
And even in Israel, you're coming out where you're saying that people are basically saying racism is a kosher concept. So in America, no one's going to say that. But in Israel, you have countless people that are openly.
Something.
Look at the elections.
Maybe
we should do next week preview the elections, because we could go over and over. But maybe we should preview the Israeli elections, and we'll take a look at these parties and what they stand for.
It is, I think, a part of Jewish culture and Jewish faith that there is a major and open emphasis on Jews meeting, mating, and marrying other Jews. And the issue of whether or not there's Sephardic versus Ashkenazic, yes, that's there, but that's not necessarily, and it is not a prouder part of our culture. And it's one that I have always been under the understanding that those distinctions are weakening and should weaken. You're telling me that that's still a big issue, that if anything, it's more pronounced. If that's true, then that's not, first of all, that is not Jewish. The Jewish idea is to be Jewish. And that includes converts. And and not to say
Yeah,
that
the proof's in the pudding. That's why I said the proof's in the pudding. You just look at who
yeah, but
the
if
head
that's
of major
true, then
Jewish
that's
organizations
not
are.
intrinsic to Judaism. That's my point.
If having blue eyes doesn't make you better, according to Judaism, there's absolutely nothing that says having blue eyes makes you better. How is it possible that 50% of people in positions of power in Jewish organizations have blue eyes? You're saying, so what's you have to, the proof is, so you're saying, oh, it's just a coincidence. There's absolutely
no, I didn't say it was just
in Judaism that says anything at all about whites being better. And it's just a coincidence that over 50% of the people in charge of Jewish organizations have blue eyes.
Cultural movement. Look, I know members of my own family here in Boston who, they consider themselves to be white. They would shudder to think of themselves as anything but, and they've spent their whole life trying to fit into that. There is a cultural imperative to fit into America. That's what that's about. That's primarily the source of that. And it's not something that's inherently Jewish. Look, we're going to have to agree to disagree on certain points. I'm going to look into this further. I'm going to talk to some Israelis about this, because if what you're saying is true, then that's, that this is becoming pronounced.
I'm going to do a stream. I could give you the academic literature of hundreds and hundreds of books that Jews have written pro-eugenic. So you don't have to read those. I just looked at a few, but just to pretend like those books don't exist.
But they do. I mean, look, eugenics is all.
Even the AJC. I'm saying the AJC testified in front of Congress. I made the point. They said ancient Israelites were white. That was the official testimony of the AJC in front of Congress.
Yeah, they were ultra liberal before World War II. They were the same eugenics as the Rockefellers were. That was the trend back then. Anyway, Dooovid, listen, I want to thank you as always for joining me this afternoon. Great talk.
I'm looking forward to your talk tomorrow. I guess it's not going to be on, you got to.
I am interviewing Dr. E. Michael Jones, and I'm really debating. I'll see how it goes. I'm not going to run it as a live stream on YouTube, because in the past, my interviews with him have been banned, and I've gotten a strike, and I'm trying to save my station. So I'm going to conduct the interview, and I'm going to live stream it on stations other than YouTube, and I'm going to record it, and I'm going to post it, and I will explain to the viewers where they can find it. If I decide not to run it on YouTube, I'll probably just go on YouTube myself briefly and announce it and tell people where to go to find it. But I'll see how it goes.
Just for your audience, hopefully early next week, if Jennifer helps, or I'll try to find someone who could help. We'll schedule, a tech call, and me, Charles, and someone else who knows how to do this. We'll try to walk Charles through to improve some of these.
I would really appreciate that, Dooovid. That would be really helpful to me, and we could really expand this show. Anyway, Dooovid, where can people watch your YouTube channel?
Yeah, I actually have a guest, a Hare Krishna author, originally from Detroit, author of 3 books: Change the Karma, Divine or Demoniac, Spiritual Movements and the Enemies Within, and Spiritual Economics Lessons from the Bhagavad Gita, Understanding and Solving Economic Problems from Dhanasvara Das. So tomorrow at noon, maybe the exact same time you're on with E. Michael Jones. So, you don't have to watch me, but it'll be on my channel. You can check it out later.
Watch Dooovid live, and then check out my E. Michael Jones interview later on on various websites that I'll be posting. All right, Dooovid, thanks a lot. I'll talk to you soon.
Yep, thanks a lot.
All right, bye-bye.